Houghton Copper Hills, Michigan, September 1907. The air, sharp with the coming autumn, carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of a hammer. It was an ordinary sound in a land of constant building, but the material was not. On the slope overlooking the Portage Canal, Eero Mäki was nailing sheets of pressed tin over the seasoned tamarack logs of his small cabin. The metal, gleaming an unnatural silver against the rustic brown of the surrounding woods, caught the low sun and threw it back in dazzling, offensive flashes. Down the path, a small group of men stopped on their way back from the Quincy mine shaft. Among them was Wesley Buckmaster, a clerk for the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, a man whose world was ordered by ledgers, assessments, and the predictable behavior of assets. He squinted up at the strange structure. "What in God's name is he doing?" asked Thomas Penrose, a shift boss whose hands were permanently calloused from timbering mine shafts. "Is he building a factory shed?" Buckmaster gave a dry chuckle, the sound of paper rustling. "It's Mäki's Folly," he declared, loud enough for the wind to carry the words up the hill. "The man's been in the copper country for over a year and still thinks like a Finn. He's making a biscuit tin to live in." The men with him laughed. The idea was absurd, a profound misunderstanding of how a man kept his family from freezing to death on the Keweenaw Peninsula. Everyone knew a cabin needed to breathe. Everyone knew you fought the cold with thick logs and a roaring fire. Cladding it in metal was worse than foolish. It was a gesture of madness. What did this quiet Finnish tin-cladder from Karelia understand about moisture, air, and the brutal physics of a Keweenaw winter that the experienced, practical men of the copper country had so completely missed? We tell the stories of forgotten American ingenuity, of the quiet geniuses who solved impossible problems with the materials at hand. If you believe these lessons in practical wisdom deserve to be remembered, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand precisely how a simple metal skin can multiply the power of insulation, and why the driest coat is always the warmest one. Have you ever seen an old building with a strange, brilliant feature that made you wonder about its story? Tell us about it in the comments below. Eero Mäki was not a logger, not a farmer, and certainly not a miner. He was a Pelletis man, a tin-cladder from the Karelian Isthmus, a land of 1,000 lakes wedged between Finland and Russia. His hands were not trained to swing an axe or drill blasting holes into basalt. They were trained to work with the delicate, unforgiving logic of thin metal. His mind was shaped by the specific problems of sheathing the great onion domes of Orthodox churches and the steep-pitched roofs of merchant houses in Viipuri, keeping the relentless damp of the Baltic climate from rotting the timbers within. He thought in terms of lap-soldered seams, thermal expansion, and the absolute impermeability of a well-made metal skin. His tools were not the broadaxe and adze of the Michigan frontier, but the soldering iron, the specialized mallet, and the razor-sharp shears of his ancient trade. He had brought his wife Aino and their 2 small children, Ilmari and Sophia, to America for the promise of work in the copper mines, a promise that paid in company scrip and rented them a standard-issue log cabin. Their first winter, 1906, had been a brutal education. It wasn't the depth of the snow or the howl of the wind that had truly shaken him. It was the insidious, invasive nature of the cold itself. It was a physical presence inside the cabin, a force that broke the tools of their lives. One morning in January, Aino had reached for the cast-iron stove lid lifter, a sturdy, common thing. As she hooked it into the lid, the metal, super-chilled to a brittle fragility, snapped cleanly at its curl with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent, frigid air. It fell to the floor in 2 useless pieces. Eero had stared at it, not with anger, but with a dawning horror. The cold didn't just make you uncomfortable, it unmade the very objects you trusted. A few weeks later, the chamber pot beneath their bed, a simple piece of porcelain, showed a delicate web of cracks. The water within had frozen solid overnight, the slow, powerful expansion of the ice bowing the ceramic outward until its glaze had crazed like a shattered mirror. The most unnerving moment came when a visitor from the company sat heavily on their modest horsehair-stuffed sofa. A series of dry popping sounds, like twigs snapping, came from within the upholstery. The guest shifted, embarrassed. Eero knew what it was. The natural oils in the horsehair had frozen, and the fibers themselves had become so brittle they were breaking under the man's weight. That was the winter Eero Mäki understood the enemy. It wasn't a simple lack of heat. It was a fundamental failure of the structure itself to protect the space within. His family was living inside a sieve, and the cold was a fine, persistent mist that permeated everything, changing the very molecular nature of their world. He would not let his family endure another winter like that. He would build them not a house, but a defense. The conventional wisdom of the Quinaw was built on a foundation of massive, seemingly indestructible logs. The standard cabin was a testament to brute force: 8, 10, sometimes 12-inch diameter tamarack or white pine logs, hewn flat on two sides, stacked and chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and sometimes horsehair. The theory was simple. Mass was insulation. A thick wall of wood was a fortress against the cold. For generations, it had been the only way, but it was a flawed theory, and the brutal lake effect climate of the Upper Peninsula was ruthlessly efficient at exposing its deepest flaw. The problem wasn't the logs themselves. The problem was water. Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake in the world, was a gigantic engine of atmospheric moisture. Even in the depths of winter, as ice formed for miles offshore, the open water breathed immense quantities of vapor into the frigid air. This vapor, driven by the prevailing northwesterly winds, saturated the landscape. For a conventional log cabin, this was a death sentence. Wood is porous. The mud and moss chinking was even more so. A typical cabin had two opposing forces working on it. From the outside, the hyper-moist, freezing air drove microscopic droplets of water deep into the grain of the logs and the gaps in the chinking. From the inside, the warm, humid air created by cooking, breathing, and boiling water for laundry sought to escape, carrying its own load of vapor. The log walls became the meeting point, a sponge where this moisture condensed and froze. A wet log is not an insulator, it is a conductor. The trapped water, and especially the ice, formed thermal bridges, pathways for heat to flee the cabin at an astonishing rate. The R value of a dry 8-inch pine log might be a respectable R7 or R8, but a log saturated with ice? Its insulating value plummeted to R2 or even less. The families living inside these cabins were fighting a losing battle. They burned cord after cord of birch and maple, turning their cast iron stoves cherry red, only to feel drafts of Arctic air slicing in from the walls. The Penrose family, in their handsome, well-built cabin a quarter-mile away, spent most of their scrip on wood. Their windows were opaque, with a half-inch of interior frost from November to March. The air inside always felt damp, carrying the faint, musty smell of perpetually wet wool and slow decay. The problem, Eero knew, wasn't that their walls were too thin. The problem was that their walls were wet. Eero Mäki began his project in late August as soon as he had saved enough from his wages at the mine. He did not tear down his cabin. He would instead give it a new skin. His methods were alien to his neighbors, who watched his progress with a mixture of pity and scorn. First, he went to the lumber mill and purchased coal boards, thin, cheap beadboard panels that were warped or stained, unfit for interior finishing. These he nailed directly to the exterior of the logs, creating a semi-smooth surface and a small, inconsistent air gap. This was merely the substrate, the canvas for his real work. Next, while Aino watched the children, he spent days in the swamps and bogs south of Houghton, harvesting sphagnum moss. He didn't use it wet, as was common for chinking. Instead, he spread the mounds of green and brown fiber on tarps in the sun, turning it daily like a farmer turning hay. For 2 weeks it cured, losing its water weight until it was a fraction of its original bulk, a vast, fluffy, incredibly light pile of dry cellulose. It was an airy, springy material, and Eero knew from his homeland that its insulating power, when dry, was phenomenal. He constructed a temporary frame of wood lath over the beadboard, creating a consistent 3-inch cavity. Into this space, he painstakingly packed the cured sphagnum, tamping it down until it formed a uniform, lightweight bat of insulation around the entire cabin. The children, Ilmari and Sophia, played in the leftover piles, burying themselves in the soft, earthy-smelling moss. Then came the layer that caused the most confusion. He purchased rolls of heavy, black-tarred building paper. This he stretched over the moss-filled framework, overlapping each seam by a good 6 inches and tacking it down tightly. To his neighbors, it looked as if he were wrapping his home like a poorly stored piece of furniture. Wesley Buckmaster, making a note in his assessment ledger, described it as an application of tar paper, purpose unknown, value negligible. Finally, the tin. He had ordered it specially from a supplier in Duluth, dozens of sheets of 28-gauge pressed tin, with a simple standing seam pattern. This was the material of his trade, and now his hands moved with an old, ingrained confidence. Starting from the bottom, he hung the first course of sheets. The crucial detail was not in the nailing, but in the seams. At every vertical join, where one panel met the next, he didn't just overlap the metal. He carefully folded the 2 edges together into a standing seam, malleting it gently into a tight, interlocking fold. Then, using a charcoal-fired soldering pot and a heavy copper iron, he flowed a bead of molten solder down the entire length of the seam, sealing it into a single, continuous, waterproof barrier. Where he had to drive a nail to fix the panel to the lath beneath, he used a nail with a lead washer, and after driving it home, he applied a dab of hot solder over the nail head itself, encasing it completely. This was the part that drew the most pointed criticism. Wesley Buckmaster stopped by one afternoon, his professional curiosity overriding his disdain. He ran a gloved finger along a freshly soldered seam. "You're wasting your time with that, Mäki," he said, his tone that of a man stating an incontrovertible fact. "And your money. Every one of those nail holes is a point of failure. That tin will rust through at every single one inside 2 winters. The water will get behind it, and the whole mess will rot off the logs. You'll be sleeping under leaking iron." Eero paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at the gleaming, sealed seam, then at the tax clerk. "The solder holds," he said quietly, his English still thick with the rhythms of his native Suomi. He picked up his hammer and returned to his work. The tap-tap-tapping resumed, a steady, unhurried declaration of faith in his craft. That evening, Aino stood with him, looking at the half-finished wall. The cabin no longer looked like a home. It looked like a strange metal box dropped into the forest. "It looks like a biscuit tin, Eero," she said, her voice holding a note of gentle worry. He turned to her and smiled, a rare, full smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It will be a warm tin," he promised. To understand the genius of what Eero Mäki was doing, you have to understand the 3 ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. A conventional log cabin in the Keweenaw failed on all 3 fronts. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. When the logs of a cabin became saturated with ice, they became an excellent conductor. Heat from the stove warmed the interior air, which warmed the interior surface of the log. That heat was then conducted directly through the ice-filled wood to the outside world, as if traveling along a metal rod. Burning more wood only accelerated the process, like trying to fill a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom. Convection is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, like air. The shoddy chinking and unsealed joints of a standard cabin were highways for air infiltration. Cold, dense air from outside would push its way in through low gaps, while the warmer, lighter air inside would escape through high gaps, creating relentless, energy-sapping drafts. You could feel it as a cold spot on the floor or see it in the constant, nervous flicker of a candle flame. This was convection stealing heat by the cubic foot. Radiation is heat transfer via electromagnetic waves. A warm stove radiates heat, which travels through the air and warms any object it strikes, a person, a piece of furniture, a wall. But the interior wall of a cold, wet log cabin was a heat sink. It absorbed that radiant energy and conducted it away, leaving the people inside feeling chilled even when the air temperature was nominally warm. Eero Mäki's system was a systematic attack on all three failure modes, but its primary brilliance lay in its control of the vapor that enabled the catastrophic conduction. The 28-gauge tin skin, meticulously soldered at every seam and nail head, was not just a water barrier, it was a 100% vapor barrier and, just as importantly, an air barrier. First, it stopped the driven moisture from Lake Superior cold. The 4-inch needle frost crystals that would grow on his neighbor's logs had no wood to cling to on Eero's cabin. They simply coated the inert metal, unable to penetrate. Second, the perfectly sealed seams, a detail no local builder would have even considered, eliminated all air infiltration. Convection was stopped dead. The air inside the Mäki cabin would be still. This created the crucial condition for his insulation to work. It stayed perfectly, profoundly dry. The 3-inch bat of cured sphagnum moss was the heart of the system. Moss, like fiberglass or wool, works by trapping millions of tiny pockets of air. Air is a terrible conductor of heat, which makes it an excellent insulator. Dry sphagnum moss has an insulating value, or R value, of approximately R3 per inch. With his 3-inch bat, Eero had created an R9 blanket around his home. Now do the math. The original tamarack logs offered about R7 of insulation. The dry sphagnum bat added R9. The beadboard, tar paper, and the small air gaps they created might add another R0.5. Eero Mäki's wall system had a total R value of R16.5. A conventional waterlogged cabin nearby, by contrast, had logs whose R value had crashed to R2, with chinking that was even worse. Add in the massive heat loss from convective drafts, and its effective R value was likely in the single digits. Eero's cabin wasn't just a little better, it was in a different thermal universe. The tin's R value was itself negligible. Metal is a conductor, after all. But its role wasn't to insulate. Its role was to be a perfect seal, a metal raincoat that allowed the real insulation, the humble, dry moss, to do its job. It was a principle learned in the damp climate of Karelia, now deployed with devastating effect against the brutal cold of Lake Superior. That winter, the lake did not hold back. It came not as a single storm, but as a 9-day siege. A low-pressure system stalled over the warmer waters of central Lake Superior, pulling up colossal amounts of moisture and dumping it on the Keweenaw Peninsula as relentless, fine-grained snow. The temperature plummeted to a sustained 24 degrees and held there, day after agonizing day. The wind never stopped, sculpting the 14 feet of accumulated snow into monstrous alien drifts. But the most spectacular feature of the storm was the frost. The air was so saturated with super-chilled water vapor that it crystallized on contact with any surface. Trees, fences, and cabins were coated in a thick, feathery crust of 4-inch needle frost crystals, turning the entire landscape into a bizarre, glittering white jungle. On the windward side of the Penrose cabin, the frost grew so thick it obscured the shape of the logs, a clear, visual indicator of the massive amount of moisture being driven into the wood. Inside their home, life had been reduced to a grim circle of survival around the stove. Thomas Penrose and his eldest son were constantly hauling wood, their entire winter supply vanishing at a terrifying rate. His wife, Mary, had hung blankets over the doorways to the bedrooms, but the cold still poured in. They ate in their coats and slept under every blanket they owned, yet they could never get warm. The walls were covered in a solid, opaque sheet of ice. A quarter-mile away, inside the metal-skinned cabin, the world was different. The only sign of the storm was the muffled howl of the wind and the snow piling up past the windowsills. Inside, a small, gentle fire of birch logs glowed in the stove, consuming wood at less than a third the rate of their neighbors. The air was still. There were no drafts. The interior walls were cool to the touch, but completely dry. There was no frost, not even on the nail heads. The quietest proof of their comfort was the mundane domesticity that the cold had not managed to halt. The children, Ilmari and Sophia, played on a rag rug on the floor in their woolen trousers and shirts, not their heavy coats. And on the small kitchen table, Aino worked, her hands dusted with flour. She was rolling out a sheet of cardamom-spiced dough for pulla, the sweet bread of her homeland. The warmth was so stable, the air so dry and still, that the yeast had risen perfectly. The scent of baking bread and cardamom filled the small, warm space, a smell of impossible normalcy in the heart of the great siege. The cold was raging outside, coating the world in ice, but inside Eero Mäki's warm tin box, his family was simply living. On the 7th day of the storm, Wesley Buckmaster and a senior company man, an assessor from Marquette named Mr. Davies, were attempting to cross a cut-over section of land on snowshoes. They were tasked with tallying timber assets before the end of the fiscal year, a job the company pursued regardless of weather. The cold was vicious, a physical entity that seemed to suck the heat directly from their bones. Their beards were frozen solid, and their gloved hands were numb. The most immediate problem, however, was bureaucratic. The ink in the well Davies carried in his satchel had frozen solid. They could not make their marks. They were miles from the nearest company office. But through the swirling snow, they saw a thin, steady plume of smoke rising from a chimney. It was Mäki's cabin. Buckmaster hesitated. He had been the most vocal critic of the Finn's strange project. Seeking shelter there felt like an admission of defeat. But Davies was a practical man. "Any port in a storm, Wesley," he said, his voice tight with cold. "Let's see if the fool's tin can has any heat." They trudged up the slope, their snowshoes sinking deep, and knocked on the door. Eero opened it. A wave of heat, not a blast from a stove, but a solid, uniform warmth washed over them. It was dry. It didn't carry the familiar damp chill of every other cabin they had ever been in. They stepped inside, stamping the snow from their boots. Buckmaster stood there for a moment, disoriented. He had braced himself for the usual misery, a hothouse zone around the stove, and freezing drafts from the walls. This was different. The warmth was everywhere. Mr. Davies, wasting no time, began to unwind the scarf from his face. He pulled off his right mitten, then his left, and flexed his bare, red fingers in the astonishingly comfortable air. Within 4 minutes, he had unbuttoned his greatcoat. He walked over to the small table and set down the frozen inkwell. Wesley Buckmaster, the man of ledgers and facts, was in a state of cognitive dissonance. The evidence of his senses was at war with the established principles of his world. He walked to the north wall, the one taking the full force of the wind. He placed his bare palm against the beadboard. It was cool, yes, but it was not the soul-stealing cold of an ice-filled log. It was the neutral coolness of a barrier that was holding its own, and it was perfectly dry. His eyes scanned the room, searching for an explanation. They landed on the deep-set windowsill. There sat a small glass jar filled with lingonberry preserves, the berries suspended in a clear, dill-flecked brine. The jar was untouched by the cold. Not a single ice crystal marred the clarity of the liquid. A visceral memory flashed in Buckmaster's mind. His own wife, Sarah, complaining just last week. The jars of tomatoes and beans they had stored on their enclosed porch, their cold storage, had all frozen solid and split, the glass cracking and spilling the contents into a frozen, useless mess. Every family on the Keweenaw used their porch for cold storage. It was a simple fact of life. Yet here, on a windowsill that should have been the coldest spot in the cabin, a simple jar of preserves sat as if it were a mild autumn day. The proof was not in a number or a theory. It was in the silent, eloquent testimony of those lingonberries. Mr. Davies's ink thawed. He opened his ledger, dipped his pen, and began to write. He glanced around the warm, quiet room, looked at Eero, and then at the assessment line for property improvements. Without a word of discussion, he wrote the Mäki cabin's improvement at full grade. Buckmaster stared at Eero, who was quietly adding a single piece of wood to the fire. The tax clerk felt the foundations of his certainty crack. He finally understood. He looked over at Davies, then back at the Finn. "My God, Mäki," Buckmaster said, his voice full of a new, grudging awe. "We all thought you were a fool." He gestured vaguely at the walls. "But you didn't insulate the cabin against the lake." He paused, finding the right words to frame the revelation. "You gave the logs a metal coat to keep the wool dry." The story of the warm tin cabin spread through the Finnish community with the speed of a revelation. Wesley Buckmaster, once the loudest critic, became its most unlikely and powerful advocate. At the Calumet and Hecla offices, he described in precise detail the dry warmth, the still air, and the jar of unfrozen lingonberries. He was a man of facts, and these were new, undeniable facts. In March of 1908, two enterprising students from Suomi College in nearby Hancock, a small institution founded to serve the Finnish immigrant community, heard the tale. As part of a student project on practical winter housing solutions, they snowshoed out to Eero Mäki's cabin. Eero, a man who had faced mockery with silence, met their earnest questions with open generosity. He explained the curing of the moss, the purpose of the tar paper, and, most importantly, demonstrated the art of the lap-soldered seam. They took meticulous notes and made detailed drawings, documenting the entire system in a thesis that would be circulated among the community. The effect was immediate and practical. The Finns of the Copper Country were not interested in abstract theories. They were interested in what worked. That autumn, as the leaves began to turn, 5 families in the mining district of Calumet began cladding their own log cabins in pressed tin. They followed the Mäki method precisely, from the dry sphagnum bat to the soldered seams. The era of the metal-skinned cabin had begun, a small regional revolution born from one man's refusal to be cold. Eero Mäki's invention was a startling act of precognition. Working with only the materials at hand and the knowledge of his old-world trade, he had created a system that building science would not formalize for another half-century. His combination of an outer cladding, an air gap, and a waterproof membrane is known today as a rain screen system, a sophisticated technique for managing moisture in walls. His meticulously sealed tin shell was a perfect air and vapor barrier, the ancestor of modern house wraps like Tyvek. He had, in essence, built a high-performance home 100 years ahead of its time, not with fancy new materials, but with moss, tar paper, and tin. There is a lesson in the quiet work of Eero Mäki that transcends building science. The men of the Copper Country, experienced and practical as they were, saw the problem of winter as a battle of brute force. Their solution was more wood for the fire, more mass for the walls. They tried to build a fortress to hold the cold at bay. They fought the enemy they could see. Eero Mäki, with the wisdom of a different tradition, understood the true enemy was invisible. It was not the cold, it was the wet. He didn't build a thicker wall to fight the lake's brutal temperature. He built a better coat to defy its insidious dampness. He didn't insulate the cabin against the lake. He gave the logs a metal coat that kept the wool dry. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the tale of Eero Mäki's warm tin cabin as inspiring as we did, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories from the annals of forgotten American innovation. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old world skills do you think held surprising advantages on the frontier? Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar methods in modern construction should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.